Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Read and Lear English. If you enjoy learning English through powerful and real-life stories, you're in the right place. Today, we're going to explore one of the most important moments in modern history, the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is not just a history lesson. It's a story about people, emotions, fear, and hope. You will learn English in a natural way with simple vocabulary, clear sentences, and real storytelling. So relax, listen carefully, and imagine yourself there in the city of Berlin on the night when everything changed. Let's begin. I still remember the cold air of that November evening in Berlin, when everything I thought was permanent suddenly began to change. At the time, I was 22 years old, living in East Berlin, on the side of the city controlled by the government of East Germany. Life there was quiet, controlled, and predictable. Too predictable, perhaps. Every morning, I woke up early in my small apartment, careful not to make too much noise. The walls were thin, and you never really knew who might be listening. My neighbor, Frau Keller, was friendly enough, but like many people, she avoided political conversations. In our country, words could be dangerous. A simple complaint about the government might travel farther than you intended. I worked in a printing factory not far from the Berlin Wall. Every day I passed near it, though not close enough to touch. Guards watched constantly, and tall fences made sure no one could get near without permission. The wall was more than just concrete. It was fear, separation, and silence. My parents used to tell me stories about the time before the wall was built in 1961. They spoke about a city that was open, where people could move freely from east to west. My mother had a cousin who lived in West Berlin, but they had not seen each other in over 20 years. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit quietly by the window, holding an old photograph and staring into the distance. Things weren't always like this, she once told me. People forget that. But I didn't forget. None of us did. We just learned to live with it. In the factory, my friend Lucas and I often worked side by side. He was a few years older than me and less careful with his words. One afternoon, while the machines were running loudly, he leaned closer and whispered, "Have you heard what's happening in Poland?" I shook my head. News from outside our country was limited, and what we did hear was often controlled. "There are protests," he said quietly. "People are demanding change, and the government is listening." I looked at him, unsure whether to believe him. "That wouldn't happen here," I replied. Lucas gave a small smile. "Maybe not yet." That word, yet, stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice small changes. People spoke a little more openly, though still carefully. In the evenings, groups gathered in churches to discuss reform and freedom. The churches had become one of the few places where people could talk without immediate fear. One evening, Lucas convinced me to join him at a meeting in a small church. I hesitated at first. I had always tried to stay out of trouble, but curiosity, and something deeper, something like hope, pushed me to go. Inside the church, the atmosphere was different from anywhere else I had ever been. People spoke openly about change, about freedom, about the possibility of a better future. Some shared stories of family members they had not seen in years. Others spoke about their frustration with the government. For the first time in my life, I felt something I had never truly experienced before. The feeling that things might not stay the same forever. As the weeks passed, the gatherings grew larger. Demonstrations began in cities like Leipzig, where thousands of people marched peacefully through the streets, demanding reform. The phrase, "Wir sind das Volk," we are the people, spread quickly. It became a symbol of unity and courage. In Berlin, the tension was rising. The government tried to maintain control, but it was clear that something was changing. Even in the factory, the supervisors seemed less confident, less strict. It was as if they too were unsure of what would happen next. One day, Lucas brought a small radio to work. It was illegal to listen to Western broadcasts, but many people did it anyway, in secret. During our break, he turned it on quietly. We listened to news from West Germany. "They're talking about us," he whispered. I leaned closer, my heart beating faster. The voice on the radio spoke about protests, about growing pressure on the East German government, about possible changes to travel restrictions. Travel restrictions. That phrase alone was enough to make my mind race. Could it really be possible? Could people finally be allowed to cross the wall? That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my mother's cousin, about the photograph she held so carefully. I imagined what it would be like to walk freely across the city, to see the other side not as a distant dream, but as a real place. The next day, rumors spread quickly. People whispered about new rules, about announcements that might be made soon. No one knew exactly what was happening, but everyone felt it, the sense that something important was coming. On November 9th, 1989, I was at home when Lucas knocked on my door, breathless. "Turn on the television," he said. We sat together watching a government official give a press conference. His name was Gunnar Schabowski. He spoke about new travel regulations, reading from a paper in front of him. At first, his words were confusing. Even he seemed unsure. Then a journalist asked a simple question. "When do these changes take effect?" There was a pause. Then Schabowski answered, "As far as I know, immediately." Immediately. Lucas and I stared at each other in disbelief. "Did he just say immediately?" I asked. "I think he did," Lucas replied. Within minutes, people began to gather in the streets. The news spread like fire. Everyone was talking about the same thing. The borders were open. "Let's go," Lucas said suddenly. "Go where?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "To the wall." My heart pounded as we stepped outside. The streets were alive with movement. People were walking quickly, some running, all heading in the same direction. There was excitement in the air, but also uncertainty. No one knew what would happen when we reached the border. As we got closer to the wall, the crowd grew larger. Thousands of people gathered near the checkpoints, calling out to the guards, demanding to be let through. I could see the guards standing there, uncertain, overwhelmed. They had always been in control, but now everything was different. The crowd was too large, too determined. I stood there just a few meters from the wall that had defined my entire life. For years, it had been a symbol of division, of fear, of limits. And now, for the first time, it looked fragile. I turned to Lucas. "Do you think they'll really open it?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked ahead, his eyes fixed on the barrier. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I think this is the moment." And as I stood there, surrounded by thousands of people, I felt something rising inside me, something stronger than fear. Hope. That word, hope, was something I had learned to hide for most of my life. In East Germany, Hope could be dangerous if it was directed at the wrong things. But that night, standing in the growing crowd near the Berlin Wall, it felt impossible to hide it any longer. People were pressing forward, closer and closer to the checkpoint. I could hear voices all around me, some shouting, some laughing nervously, others calling out to the guards. The air was filled with energy, confusion, excitement, and fear all mixed together. "Open the gate!" someone shouted. "We have the right to travel!" Another voice added. I noticed a woman near me holding her child tightly. She looked both terrified and determined. An older man beside her kept repeating, "This is history. This is history," as if he needed to convince himself it was real. Lucas stood next to me, his hands clenched into fists. "If they don't open it," he began, but didn't finish the sentence. I knew what he meant. For years, the guards had strict orders. People had been arrested and even shot trying to cross without permission. The memory of those stories still lived in all of us. But something was different now. The guards looked uncertain. They spoke to each other, checking papers, making phone calls. One of them wiped sweat from his forehead, even though the night was cold. It was clear they had not expected this. "Why aren't they stopping us?" I asked quietly. "Because they don't know how," Lucas replied. More and more people arrived. The crowd became so large that it was impossible to move freely. We were pushed forward slowly, step by step, until we were only a few meters from the barrier. Then something happened that I will never forget. A man near the front climbed onto a small platform and shouted, "They said we can cross. The borders are open." A wave of sound moved through the crowd. Cheers, cries, laughter. Some people didn't believe it. Others didn't care if it was true or not anymore. "Let us through," people shouted again, louder this time. The guards hesitated. One of them raised his hand as if trying to calm the crowd, but his voice was lost in the noise. The pressure from the people kept growing. It wasn't violent, but it was unstoppable. I felt my heart racing. My thoughts were spinning. Was this really happening? Could a single announcement on television change everything? Then suddenly, the barrier lifted. At first, it moved slowly, almost as if it too was unsure. Then it rose fully, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. No one moved. It was as if we all needed a second to understand what we were seeing. Then someone stepped forward, and then another. And then the entire crowd surged ahead. "Come on!" Lucas shouted, grabbing my arm. We moved with the crowd, crossing the checkpoint that had once been impossible to pass. My legs felt weak, but I kept walking. I couldn't stop. As I stepped across, I realized something incredible. I had just left East Berlin and entered West Berlin. No one stopped me. No one asked for papers. No one shouted orders. I was free to cross. On the other side, the scene was completely different. People from West Berlin were waiting for us. They were cheering, clapping, welcoming us with open arms. Some offered flowers. Others handed out drinks and food. A woman I had never seen before hugged me tightly. "Welcome," she said, her voice full of emotion. I didn't know what to say. I had never experienced anything like this. Lucas laughed, a sound I had never heard from him before. Loud, free, full of joy. "We made it," he said. "Can you believe it?" I shook my head. "No," I admitted. "I can't." We walked further into the streets of West Berlin. The lights seemed brighter. The buildings looked different. Everything felt alive in a way I had never known. People were climbing onto the wall itself, dancing, waving flags, celebrating together. Some had brought tools, hammers, chisels, and were already chipping away at the concrete. I looked back at the wall. For my entire life, it had been a symbol of division. It had separated families, friends, and an entire nation. And now people were standing on top of it, laughing, celebrating, breaking it apart piece by piece. "Do you want to try?" Lucas asked, pointing at a man who was handing out a small hammer. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. The man handed me the hammer with a smile. "Your turn," he said. I stepped closer to the wall. Up close, it looked rough and worn. I could see marks left by others who had already begun to break it. I raised the hammer. For a second, I paused. Then I struck the wall. The sound echoed in the night. A small piece of concrete broke off and fell to the ground. I stared at it, hardly believing what I had just done. It was just a small piece, but it felt like something much bigger. Lucas clapped me on the back. "You're part of history now," he said. I picked up the piece of concrete and held it in my hand. It was cold and rough, but to me it felt like proof that the impossible had become real. As the night went on, the celebration continued. Strangers talked to each other like old friends. People laughed, cried, and shared stories. It didn't matter where you came from, east or west. Everyone was part of the same moment. At one point, I found myself standing quietly, watching everything around me. I thought about my parents, about my mother's cousin, about all the years of separation. Things weren't always like this, she had said, and now they weren't like that anymore. Lucas joined me again, holding 2 drinks he had somehow managed to get. He handed one to me. "To freedom," he said. I raised the cup. "To freedom," I repeated. But even as I said it, I realized something important. This was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Because while the wall was opening and people were celebrating, there were still many questions. What would happen next? Would Germany become one country again? How would life change for all of us who had lived under such different systems for so long? I didn't have the answers, but for the first time in my life, that didn't scare me. As I stood there in Berlin, surrounded by thousands of people celebrating together, I felt ready to face whatever came next. Because the wall had fallen, and with it, the limits I had always known were beginning to fall as well. The night slowly turned into morning, but no one seemed ready to leave. In Berlin, time itself felt different, as if history had pressed pause just to let us live inside that moment a little longer. The streets of West Berlin were still full, people laughing, singing, hugging strangers, standing on top of the Berlin Wall as if it had never been meant to divide us at all. I hadn't slept, but I didn't feel tired. My body was awake in a way I had never experienced before. Everything I saw felt important, like I needed to remember every detail so I could tell this story again and again. Lucas and I walked for hours. At some point, we found ourselves near a busy street where music was playing from somewhere I couldn't see. A group of young people were dancing, their movements wild and free. I watched them for a while, realizing how different this side of the city felt. Not just physically, but emotionally. "Do you think it will stay like this?" I asked. Lucas looked around, then shrugged. "I don't know, but I think nothing will ever go back to how it was." That thought stayed with me. As the sky grew lighter, I began to feel something else rising inside me. Not just excitement, but a quiet pull toward home, toward my parents. I need to go back, I said. Lucas nodded. Me too. We didn't say much more. We both understood. This moment was too important not to share. Crossing back into East Berlin felt strange. Only hours earlier it had felt like a one-way boundary. Now people were moving freely in both directions, some going back to tell their families, others coming through for the first time. The guards were still there, but everything about them had changed. They no longer looked powerful or frightening. They looked tired, and maybe even relieved. As I walked through the checkpoint, I turned back one more time. The wall was still standing, but it no longer felt like a wall. It felt like something already disappearing. When I reached our apartment, the building was unusually quiet. I climbed the stairs quickly and opened the door. My mother was sitting at the table, exactly where I had left her the night before. The television was still on. She stood up immediately. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice full of worry. "I went to the wall," I said, still catching my breath. "Mama, it's open." She stared at me, not speaking. "It's really open," I repeated. "People are crossing. I crossed." For a moment she didn't move. Then her hand went to her mouth, and tears filled her eyes. "Are you sure?" she whispered. I stepped closer and placed the small piece of concrete into her hand, the piece I had broken from the wall. "This is from it," I said. She looked down at it as if it were something sacred. My father came into the room, having heard our voices. "What's going on?" he asked. My mother turned to him, her voice shaking. "The wall, it's open." He looked at me, searching my face for the truth. I nodded. "It's over," I said quietly. He didn't speak right away. He simply sat down, as if his legs could no longer hold him. For years, my parents had lived with quiet acceptance. They had learned not to expect change. And now, suddenly, everything they had accepted was gone. "We can go," my mother said softly. "We can finally go." I knew what she meant. Her cousin. Without wasting time, we decided to try that very day. It felt impossible to wait. After so many years, even a few more hours seemed too long. The three of us joined the growing number of people heading toward the border. The atmosphere was different from the night before, still full of excitement, but calmer, more certain. People were smiling openly now. Some carried bags as if preparing for longer visits. Others walked hand in hand, afraid to let go. When we crossed into West Berlin together, my mother held my arm tightly, as if she needed to feel that it was real. "I never thought I would see this again," she said. We made our way to the address she had memorized years ago. She didn't need to look at a map. Some memories never fade. When we finally stood in front of the building, she hesitated. "What if she's not there?" she asked. I didn't know what to say, but then the door opened. An older woman stepped out, pausing when she saw us. She looked at my mother carefully, as if trying to recognize a face from a distant memory. "Anna?" my mother said, her voice barely more than a breath. The woman's eyes widened. "Maria," she replied, and then they were in each other's arms. I stepped back, watching them. Decades of separation disappeared in a single moment. They cried, laughed, and spoke all at once, their words rushing out as if they had been waiting for years. My father wiped his eyes quietly. "History," he said softly. "We're living inside it." Later, as we sat together in Anna's apartment, sharing stories and memories, I realized how much had been lost and how much could now be found again. But not everything would be easy. In the days that followed, life began to change quickly. The government of East Germany started to lose control. People demanded more reforms, more freedom, more truth. The old systems began to break down. There were questions everywhere. What would happen to jobs, to money, to identity? Many people were excited, but others were uncertain, even afraid. Lucas and I talked about it often. Freedom is complicated, he said one evening. I nodded. But it's still better than what we had. He smiled. Yes, that part is clear. Months later, discussions about reunification began. The idea that Germany could become one country again no longer seemed impossible. It seemed inevitable. And on October 3rd, 1990, it became official. Germany was united. The country of East Germany no longer existed. I stood once more near the place where the wall had divided us. Large parts of it were gone now, replaced by open space and movement. People passed freely, barely noticing where the border had once been. I reached into my pocket and touched the small piece of concrete I still carried. A reminder, not just of the wall, but of everything it had meant, and everything its fall had changed. I wonder, Lucas said beside me, what people will remember about this. I thought for a moment. They'll remember that change is possible, I said, even when it feels impossible. He nodded slowly, and as I looked around at the city, no longer divided, no longer controlled in the same way, I understood something clearly. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not just the end of a barrier. It was the beginning of a new way of living, of thinking, of hoping. And I had been there to see it, to feel it, to live it. Today, let's learn some English from the story of the Berlin Wall. Stories are powerful. They help you learn real English, how people speak, feel, and express ideas. Here's a simple tip. Don't translate everything. Instead, try to feel the meaning. For example, when you hear, I felt hope, just imagine that feeling. Don't translate word by word. Now let's fix some common mistakes. Many learners say, I'm very happy that wall fell, but the correct sentence is, I was very happy that the wall fell. Remember, use was for past feelings, and fell is the past of fall. Another mistake. People go to West Berlin yesterday. Correct version, people went to West Berlin yesterday. And one more, I didn't know what happened. Correct sentence, I didn't know what happened. After didn't, always use the base verb. Keep practicing. Small corrections make big improvements. Now it's time to build your vocabulary. Learning words through stories is one of the best ways to remember them. Let's look at some useful words from today's story. Barrier means something that blocks your way. The wall was a barrier between people. Checkpoint is a place where people are stopped and checked. People had to pass checkpoints to cross. Crowd means a large group of people. A crowd gathered near the wall. Freedom means the ability to live and act freely. People wanted freedom to travel. Hesitate means to pause because you feel unsure. She hesitated before opening the door. Relieved means feeling calm after fear or worry. The guards looked relieved. Reunite means to come together again after a long time. Families reunited after many years. Demand means to ask strongly for something. People demanded change. Celebrate means to show happiness. People celebrated in the streets. Hope means believing something good will happen. Hope was everywhere that night. Here's a learning tip. Don't just read these words, use them, say them out loud, make your own sentences. For example, I feel hope. The crowd is big. Practice every day. That's how you grow. Now it's time for shadowing practice. Listen and repeat after me. I was there that night. The wall was open. People were shouting. I felt afraid, but hopeful. We walked together. No one stopped us. I couldn't believe it. Families met again. We were finally free. Everything changed that night. Speak slowly, then try again faster. Copy the feeling. Not just the words. Practice every day. Even 5 minutes helps. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story and learned something new. Now I have a few questions for you. Have you ever learned English from a story? Which new word do you like the most? Can you make a sentence with hope? Write your answers in the comments. See you next time.